Welcome to week 10. Thanks to all of you for some vigorous conversation, some debate over the interpretation of Jesus' final discourse this past week. I think we had some charitable and critical engagement with one another with my presentation of the passage. And I hope that kind of sort of careful consideration will lead you back to the text with a renewed sense of commitment to its particulars, to the way that discourse is presented in the course of the narrative, with what occasions Jesus' words of the discourse, how they're framed by the story. And of course, as I want to continue to reiterate, taking into account the sort of framework of Old Testament language and hope, the background of the prophets, and the way that we make sense of how Jesus uses their words in his own teaching. It's no accident that we're moving directly from Jesus's foreboding and haunting words in this final discourse to the narrative of the fall of Jesus himself, because the culmination of the narrative is how Jesus embodies the future of his people, and through it the future of the whole world, so that what we are going to see in Matthew 26 and 27, as we'll study this week, is Jesus' embodiment of the destruction that he has described in Matthew 24 to 25, and consequently the revelation of Jesus through that destruction of his body and the ramifications that it anticipates, ramifications that will ripple out through the sort of span of his generation, but then beyond, as the kingdom of heaven is revealed through that destruction and begins to touch directly all of the peoples of the world through Jesus' disciples, who in turn are called to disciple all the peoples of the world. I've divided the final segment of the narrative from Matthew 26 until the end into two sections, because I want to be careful to devote some serious attention to the story of Jesus' death in this next week, and to allow a bit of a pause before we then continue in the story to hear its conclusion with an empty tomb and his appearing to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, and then eventually his remaining 11 apostles in Galilee, while a plot to cover up reports of his resurrection is already taking place in Jerusalem. The reason perhaps that I want to sort of slow down our study, if we can, in these last couple of weeks, is the same kind of difficulty that presents itself to us here in the story of Jesus' death as what we faced in our interpretation of his final discourse, namely our tendency to seize upon certain general ideas that we have about Jesus' death, and then to find ourselves unable to pay careful attention to the particular narrative presentation of Jesus' death. Many of us have come to know the significance of Jesus' death in terms of a kind of mystical transaction that takes place in the middle of nowhere and has consequently sort of been destoried, extracted from any sort of narrative drama that would give a particular meaning to Jesus' death, help us to understand the nature of its power, how it implicates us variously. And so, as you'll see in my prompt to the discussion forum for this week, I am trying to encourage us to sort of recover the narrative presentation of Jesus' death, and then to ask what that narrative presentation contributes to the meaning of that death, and how that might perhaps challenge some of our sometimes de-storied theological ways of describing Jesus' death and its power, say, for the forgiveness of sins. So do be mindful once again this week as you're studying of the importance of taking seriously the narrative presentation of Jesus' death, down to all of those details, all of the narrative art that goes into how that death is portrayed in a very intricate sequence of events that are all intimately tied to one another, as well as paralleling the judgment that Jesus has foretold in his last discourse. What we are going to see is that Jesus endures the judgment that is coming according to his prediction. He makes that judgment his own, and in fact, he is revealed as the judge of his people and of the world by the way that he is judged. It's a deep irony then to the sort of dynamics of the culmination of the narrative, as Jesus is the victim of all kinds of terrible injustice perpetrated by even his closest friends, and yet in so doing is the revelation of God's justice. God's justice that is able to inhabit the worst failures of the human and turn them into the liberating power of God. This tells us something about what you might call the infinite distinction that there is between God and the human, that nevertheless yields to God's making the human God's very own. So that in this culmination of the story, Jesus is God with us. So lots of searching, rich theological claims that are delivered by the story of Jesus' death in Matthew. And I hope that you will come away with the sense that the elaborate threads of the narrative and all of their thematic color are drawn together in these concluding scenes of the story, because it is finally Jesus' death that reveals fully who he is, because it is kind of the completeness of the way that he lives. He completes his living by the way that he dies. And it's, of course, that way of living and dying that then gives way to his fearsome resurrection from among the dead, which we'll study next week in week 11, closing week of our course. I look forward to the discussion. There's just one discussion forum for this week, because you have a lot on your plate with your peer reviews of your advanced interpretive papers and touching those up when you get suggestions from your peer reviewer by Saturday at the latest. Maybe a quick word, because I've received a few questions about the advanced interpretive paper, just to clarify the relationship between this advanced assignment and the working phase of the assignment that you've already completed. Some of you have asked whether or not parts of your working paper might find their way verbatim into your advanced interpretive paper. And in principle, there's no reason why that can't happen, but I would just caution you because your advanced interpretive paper does need to show an additional kind of level of development from the working phase of your interpretation of the passage. You're now not just asking questions of the passage, analyzing different possibilities, but articulating a singular interpretation that you are substantiating, defending with one sustained argument over the course of your paper. Now, as that happens, it may be that particular sentences from your working paper reappear in your advanced paper. I don't think there's anything wrong with that per se. You're not going to get dinged for that. But do make sure that you are carrying the analysis that you conducted in a preliminary working way to that advanced level of now a polished interpretation of the passage that has already completed a significant sort of phase of analysis and is now prepared to declare what the passage says and to defend it, to clarify with your interpretation what the passage has to say. So hopefully that clarifies the kind of nature of this advanced interpretive paper. Also, just a reminder that for those of you that live in and near the Pasadena area, Los Angeles area, or are coming to Pasadena for the commencement ceremony at the end of week 11, you are invited to my house on Friday, September 14th, around 7 p.m. or so for drinks and conversation. I'll send out my address, and we'll try to get a computer up somewhere here in my house with the Blue Jeans classroom open in case people who are not in the area want to beam in and say hello and join us for a toast to completion of the course, and for some of us, the completion of our studies at Fuller. So I do look forward to celebrating with as many of you as possible. Looking forward to the discussion this week, and what I hope will be a kind of transformative meditation on this scandalous and powerful heart of our faith as disciples of Jesus. Thanks again for your hard work. I'm learning a lot from the discussion. I think we're learning from one another, and so I expect some more rich conversation this week. God bless you as you study.